Should it be made, a commitment to do more in Afghanistan would be one sign that Australia is entirely serious about its overseas responsibilities. It would build on the reputation Australia established during the Howard years as a power that well and truly punched to its weight. This was especially obvious in Asia, where the Howard government achieved an intimacy and regional access that Paul Keating could only have dreamed of, against his prediction that Asian countries wouldn't deal with John Howard. In Howard's well-known observation, there turned out to be no need for us to choose between our geography and our history. Diplomatic advances in our neighbourhood were achieved while deepening our relationship with the US and generally improving relationships further afield. Indeed, Howard conclusively demonstrated that a strong alliance with the United States was an asset rather than a liability in our relations with Asia. Those key relationships have not noticeably strengthened, despite the change to a Prime Minister who can speak to the Chinese in their own language. Japan has been a steadfast friend of Australia and our most important regional partner, at least since the Menzies government negotiated the trade treaty in the 1950s. A fellow democracy and ally of the United States, Japan has traditionally been given high priority by Australian Prime Ministers travelling overseas early in their term. In his first overseas visit, Mr Rudd included China but excluded Japan. Many in Japan concluded that we had somehow downgraded the relationship, especially since the Rudd government unilaterally abolished the quadrilateral security dialogue with the US, Japan and India, seemingly to accommodate Chinese objections. Most recently, the Rudd government re-announced without warning, on the eve of the arrival in Australia of Foreign Minister Okada, that it would be taking Japan to the International Court over whaling. While we would all like whaling to stop, the government has managed to antagonise a friend. Notwithstanding the Prime Minister's assertion about a new strategic relationship, the abolition of the quadrilateral security dialogue alienated India as well as Japan. There will be no breakthroughs here while the government maintains its ban on uranium exports. This stance clearly has far more to do with ALP internal politics than with New Delhi's failure to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The government has refused to budge, despite the opposition to the current policy of Labor's longest-serving Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, and despite the fact that greater Indian access to civilian nuclear technology would help to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. The Obama government in America has accepted that India could not sign the NPT because it possesses nuclear weapons, but has nevertheless approved uranium sales because of India's flawless record in not proliferating nuclear technology. As previously announced by Julie Bishop, subject to suitable safeguards, a coalition government would follow the Obama policy. The Howard government engineered big improvements in the relationship with Indonesia after the East Timor complications of 1999. The 2002 Bali process helped to deal with irregular immigration. Australia and immigration signed a new security cooperation treaty in 2006. Jakarta supported Australian membership of the annual East Asia Summit. Subsequent to the former government's decisive steps to stop people smuggling, Australian-Indonesian relations were barely disturbed by this issue. The resumption of people smuggling has predictably generated strains, especially during the Oceanic Viking saga. As well, Indonesia has been noticeably unenthusiastic about Mr Rudd's aggressive championing of his concept of an Asia-Pacific community. A government that claims to be attuned to Asia should surely have consulted in advance about an initiative which the Indonesian Foreign Minister has described as not in synergy with what we have. A coalition government would work cooperatively to make existing regional bodies work better rather than creating a new one. Clearly, the economic development of China is one of the defining characteristics of our era. China recently overtook Japan as Australia's #1 export market, as well as being our biggest source of imports and biggest overall trading partner. The Howard government showed that it was possible to have a strong relationship with China while managing differences over sensitive issues like ministerial contact with the Dalai Lama and Taiwan. As the previous government put it, the guiding principles of managing the relationship were shared interests and mutual respect. By contrast, the current government's approach has often been inconsistent. Last year, at a conference in London, the Prime Minister ostentatiously refused to be seated next to a Chinese diplomat he knew well. The 2009 Defence White Paper suggested that Australia is on a collision course with China. On the other hand, the government seems to have made secret deals with China not to meet the Dalai Lama and to have dropped the long-established practice of annual ministerial visits to Taiwan to pursue economic interests. These concessions, though, don't seem to have won much reciprocity from Beijing. In the Sternhout trial, for instance, Chinese authorities ignored the consular agreement that our officials should have access to the trials of Australians. In part show trial, in part Star Chamber exercise, it's left doubts about what the Chinese government considers to be commercial secrets and shaken the confidence of businesses dealing with China. Although there can be miscarriages of justice in any system, it's hard to avoid a sense that whose treatment owed as much to considerations of state than to any personal fault. Inevitably, the Sternhout trial has reinforced concerns about government-controlled Chinese companies investing in Australia. Australia needs and welcomes foreign investment. Questions arise, though, when state-owned companies with strategic as well as commercial objectives seek a controlling interest in key assets. The Foreign Investment Review Board in each case makes a judgment about what is in Australia's overall best interest. There probably shouldn't be a hard and fast rule here. Still, if the ownership by the Australian government of key businesses would not normally be considered in the national interest, ownership by a foreign government would seem even more problematic. Now, multilateral institutions and international organisations matter, but it's important to put the most effort into the context where Australia can make the most difference. The Coalition supports multilateral institutions which serve a clear national purpose. For example, the G20 Forum, which Peter Costello helped to formalise, has emerged as a more representative global body than the G8. The Coalition supports the existing regional Asia-Pacific bodies, the Commonwealth of Nations, which celebrated its 50th anniversary this year, and the various organisations of the United Nations, including the World Trade Organisation. On the other hand, it's hard to see much taxpayer value in the Rudd government's anti-nuclear and Security Council membership campaigns. Over this year and next, the government is spending $9 million to promote nuclear disarmament, much of which will be spent on the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, which Mr Rudd set up. Of course, anything that Gareth Evans and his fellow Commission members could do to prevent the emergence of a nuclear-armed Iran or North Korea would be welcome. That prospect, though, seems unlikely, and meanwhile, the Commission uses taxpayer dollars to promote the improbable notion of a world free of nuclear weapons. It's largely a replay of the Keating government's futile Canberra Commission. A coalition government would reconsider whether this body makes any useful contribution to Australia's non-proliferation objectives. Similarly, it's worth recalling that the Howard government considered and ultimately rejected the option to campaign for a non-permanent seat on the Security Council. The massive diplomatic effort required would have diverted attention away from core policy interests to more peripheral areas in order to secure votes, all for an uncertain purpose other than a nebulous sense of temporarily enhanced international status. There are strong grounds for suspecting that the government's increased diplomatic activism in Africa and retreat from the once bipartisan policy of opposing one-sided anti-Israel UN resolutions relate to the campaign to secure a Security Council seat in 2013 at a cost to taxpayers of $11 million. Curiously, the government's commitment to spend 0.5% of gross national income on overseas aid will be achieved by large increases in the forward estimates in 2011 and 2012, which are the years leading up to the UN vote on our bid for a seat. Using the aid budget to help secure the necessary votes would mean spreading money through Africa and Latin America. These regions certainly need help, but they are the places where Europe, the US and Canada already focus their aid efforts. For reasons of impact and national interest, the Coalition believes that Australia's aid effort should focus on the Asia-Pacific region. A Coalition government would not proceed with the UN Security Council bid and would deploy the freed-up diplomatic capacity to advance our core interests. While the Coalition would match the government's commitments on overseas aid, this effort should be refocused to areas where we can make the most impact and into the activities that most effectively reduce poverty. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Clausewitz once said that diplomacy without arms was like an orchestra without instruments. Australia needs armed forces that are capable of supporting our interests around the globe. The defence of Australia does not start on our borders. Historically, the defence of Australia has required a prodigious military commitment to Europe. Currently, it requires significant military commitments in the Middle East, Central and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Howard government's improvements to the structure and capacity of our defence forces have made these commitments more effective and easier to sustain. Between 1996 and 2007, the annual defence budget increased from a little over $10 billion to $22 billion. Over this period, the Armed Forces tooth-to-tail ratio improved from 45 to 66%. By next year, thanks to decisions taken by the Howard government, Australia will have 7 regular infantry battalions and a regular commando battalion, up from the 4 regular battalions the Army had been reduced to in 1966. Each battalion now also has greater strength, better equipment, improved mobility and more supporting firepower, including from M1 tanks and Javelin missiles. The Royal Australian Navy and Air Force have also benefited from Howard government decisions to acquire 24 Super Hornet fighters, 14 new Armidale-class patrol boats and 4 C-17 long-range jet transports. A longer-term legacy will be the 3 large air warfare destroyers plus 2 helicopter landing ships that will each be bigger in tonnage than Australia's last aircraft carrier, the Melbourne. An important consequence of the Howard government's work with the armed forces was improved recruitment and, to a lesser extent, retention. In 2007, almost 9,000 young Australians joined the Defence Force, which was the best result in 10 years and the second best in 30 years. The Defence Gap Year program was an innovative way to introduce young people to the possibility of a military career. A coalition government would re-energise this excellent program and ensure that there are at least 1,000 places made available to school leavers each year. By contrast, the Rudd government has talked about improving the capacity of our armed forces but shown little seriousness in delivering it. The 2009 Defence-wide paper included a massive wish list of acquisitions, 12 submarines, 20 frigates and 100 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft. But the 144-page document contained just over 1 page of costings. Only after the Coalition raised the issue did the government reluctantly disclose a total cost somewhere between $245 and $275 billion. The government's own financial projections reveal a $25 to $40 billion black hole in major capital equipment costs, even with an already reduced maximum of 72 Joint Strike Fighters. The Coalition supports the case for new submarines to replace the current fleet. The government, though, has yet to provide credible costings or a convincing rationale for 12 new boats, especially since it seems to think that the 3 it insists are currently operational can meet immediate needs. In fact, it's likely that only 1 submarine is available at any particular time because of systemic maintenance problems and chronic crew shortage. As well, it seems that it's hard to sustain submarine operations beyond 4 to 5 days because of mechanical problems. A further problem is the skewing of defence spending towards increases in the number of bureaucrats, forecast to grow by 3.5% this financial year, in contrast to a 1.1% increase in the number of uniformed personnel. Apparently, there are now no fewer than 19 senior Defence Department officials entitled to travel overseas first class with their spouses. The Coalition will release a detailed defence policy nearer the election, including fully costed plans to fund capital acquisitions. The Coalition aims to continue the Howard government's practice of increasing defence spending by 3% a year out to 2018. I can announce today, though, that one major acquisition, as soon as possible, would be 3 unmanned Global Hawk surveillance aircraft. In a day, a Global Hawk can keep under surveillance 40,000 square nautical miles. These aircraft would help to protect the vast oil and gas projects now progressing on the Northwest Shelf. Real-time surveillance and their vast area of coverage should allow much earlier detection and interception of illegal boat arrivals. Improved intelligence would also make it easier to track and to help boats in danger of sinking. One way to help Defence Force retention would be to improve conditions for serving personnel and their families. The Rudd government promised $33 million to deliver a program of free healthcare to the family members of ADF personnel, but later cut this to $12 million. The Coalition would restore proper funding to this program. The government has also reneged on its commitment before the 2007 election to restore the value of military superannuation by rectifying indexation arrangements. The current budgetary situation makes it hard to commit right now to a fairer military pension system. Even so, it will be important to tackle this issue as soon as the budget is back in surplus. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as important as any element of national security, especially in the post-9/11 world, are anti-terrorist intelligence operations. Over the past decade, Australia has massively expanded its counter-terrorism capacity through state and federal police, ASIO and ASIS. We have strengthened participation in intelligence sharing with our key allies. We have cooperated closely with our key regional partners, especially Indonesia. The hatred of extremists for our way of life remains, as does their search for opportunities to do us harm. The fact that there have been no terrorist attacks in Australia and few involving Australians abroad testifies to our substantial success. And in this vital area, the Rudd government has continued to build on the good work of its predecessor. Keeping the Australian people safe is the most basic task of government. It was my privilege to serve in an administration which left Australia economically, militarily and diplomatically stronger than perhaps it had ever been, and to learn from a Prime Minister who was our most effective international statesman since Sir Robert Menzies. The former government's policies and judgments are open to question, as every government's are, but Australia's current standing owes much to its work. The respect accorded to our current Prime Minister owes as much to our country's qualities as it does to his own. In large measure, Mr Rudd is welcome in the councils of the world because our country has earned it. I am conscious of the responsibilities I carry, even as Australia's alternative Prime Minister, and of the debt that I owe to my predecessors, whose fine example I will strive to follow. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to come to the Lowy Institute to deliver my first significant speech on this very necessary and very important topic. I hope I haven't detained you too long, but I hope I've given you a clear indication into my thinking, into the Coalition's thinking, into the issues we face, and into some of the policy measures that we will be taking in the months and years ahead. Thank you so much.
Well, Mr Abbott, thank you so much for taking the time in this very, very busy election year to come and give us a very comprehensive presentation on Australia's national security fundamentals. You've outlined to us just how broad and how complex the national security agenda has become. Thank you for the clarity with which you set out the Coalition's philosophies on national security and foreign policy. And thanks for the clarity with which you outlined the Coalition's specific policies that it'll be taking into the election. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along today. I'd like now to invite all of you to join us upstairs, the next level up, for some refreshments, some sandwiches and coffee and juice. and an opportunity to mingle a little bit with Mr. Abbott and his team and talk a little bit more about the speech. So thanks very much for coming along today. Thank you.